Good evening and welcome to Bridging Asia, the Singapore Debates, live on Channel News Asia. I'm your moderator, Gaurav Kirti. This series brings together prominent thinkers and advocates of debate to discuss the hottest issues in Asia. The topic tonight is Myanmar, a country hogging the headlines at the moment. The question up for debate is, will Myanmar be a democracy in a decade? Earlier, we polled the studio audience and visitors to our microsite, and here's how the two sides are divided now. 71.3% of people believe that Myanmar will be a democracy in a decade, so it looks like there's overwhelming support for the affirmative at this point. Can our speakers persuade them otherwise? That'll be the challenge for tonight's debate. And the results for tonight will be decided by this interactive vote. You can take part throughout the show by casting your vote at the website below. Let's meet our panel of judges who will be commenting on the team's performances and asking questions throughout the debate. First up, Mr. Chelva Raja, Senior Counsel and Singapore's non-resident High Commissioner to Papua New Guinea. Ms. Eleanor Wong, playwright and Associate Professor in the Law Faculty at the National University of Singapore. And Mr. Adrian Tan, Director of Dispute Resolution at Singapore law firm Drew Napier. Many thanks for joining us. Now let's meet our speakers. The first speaker arguing for the affirmative that Myanmar will be a democracy in a decade is Ms. Mo Tuzar. Now, she's the coordinator for the Myanmar Study Group at the Institute of Southeast Asian Studies right here in Singapore. Her teammate is Mr. Romain Koyod. Mr. Koyod joins us from Yangon, and he's the managing director of the Myanmar office of Vriens and Partners, a business consultancy firm that provides advice to foreign investors going into Myanmar. Arguing the negative that Myanmar will not be a democracy in a decade is Ms. Kin Omar. She's the coordinator of Burma Partnership, a regional advocacy network of civil society groups working to push democracy and human rights in her country. Supporting her is Dr. Pavin Chachaval Pongon. He is a former diplomat and has written extensively on the politics of Southeast Asia, including that of Myanmar. Welcome to all of you. Now, the first speakers will have 3 minutes each to establish their case and present the main arguments. They'll then have a minute of rebuttal time. Let's get this debate started straight away. Ms. Mo, as a local observing the changes now from outside back home, what are your thoughts on Myanmar's progress? Do you think it can be a democracy within a decade? Your 3 minutes starts now.
Well, Gaurav, thank you very much for this opportunity. It is a great honor to be here. Looking at Myanmar, the country of my birth, I still go back from time to time though, reforms initiated and implemented today, all of us here in the audience would have thought it unthinkable had they happened or, were they even stated before March 2011. So what are we looking forward to now, 10 years down the line? We're looking forward to a system of government where we will have the dignity to live in peace, and a government that respects our needs and reflects our desires and aspirations, including our right to participate or to have a voice in decisions that affect our lives. Why am I optimistic that in 10 years' time, in 2022, the necessary institutions and capacities will be there to see this day? Firstly, because of the reforms, what we have now in Myanmar is a new political system that is conducive to democracy. Many have criticized the 2008 constitution, but nevertheless, that provides the basis, the foundation on which we can progress towards democratization, new institutions that have been created, especially the parliament, becoming increasingly influential, finding their voice. There is decentralization, which is starting to be introduced through the local governments or regional assemblies that they call in Myanmar. Most importantly, if democracy is a culture of mutual recognition, we see that already developing between the two key players in the whole political process, the president and Aung San Suu Kyi. Many people also state a fear of the political dominance of the military, but there are checks and balances to this dominance. We now have a very vibrant civil society, something that probably in my wildest dreams I would not have been able to imagine growing up as a young person under a military regime. There are growing civil rights provided for by the various new laws and regulations being drafted, amended, promulgated. The restrictions on the media have been amazing. There is an increasingly free media. And this can bode only well for the kind of voice and accountability that we would want to see in a democratized system. There is also a strong political opposition. The National League for Democracy is now firmly, squarely part of the political process. And we are seeing also an assertive private sector organizing to defend its interests and also push for economic growth, which, after all, underpins political development. So there is room for cautious optimism.
Well, thank you very much, Ms. Mo. So there's room for cautious optimism, and what you're saying is that a vibrant civil society might be one of the pressure factors. We turn now over to the negative, where, Ms. Kin, you're part of that vibrant civil society, and yet you don't think Myanmar will be a democracy in a decade. Tell us why in your 3 minutes.
Well, for my past 24 years, I've been non-stop, like 24 hours, 7 days a week activist. And my focus is on the human rights, of course. So if for those of us who believe that democracy is for the people, by the people, of the people, then we have to look where Burma is and where Burma will be in the next 10 years. Because the very constitution, which is in effect, is for the military, by the military, of the military. The military stays above the law. You can't take any judicial action against the military, which is the main perpetrator of the human rights violations for the past decades. That continues to be the case as we speak today. Since the President Thein Sein came into power, you have seen already the government, the Burma army, already launched military offensives against the ethnic people. Particularly in the northern of the country, in the Kachin state, there is a non-stop fighting for more than 1 year now, which already led to more than 90,000 of the internally displaced people, women and children. There's more like 61 cases of the military rape. About half of the women were killed by the Burma army. And we're seeing also the Rohingya community, most vulnerable on the western side of the Burma, where the government itself is complicated in itself in this communal violence, where they give favor to the one community and then persecute the other, which is the Rohingya, vulnerable Rohingya community people. When you also see that President Thein Sein, when he gave the 2 times of the order to the Burma army to stop the military offensives against the Kachin people in the northern state, that 2 times of the powers never been heeded. And then you also see that there is no sign of the military being like withdrawing or being reducing of the size, which is more than 4,000 army size. We don't need that army in our country. Our people, Burma is comprised of multi-ethnic. More than 44% of our country's population are comprised of the ethnic minority nationalities. And these people are not protected in this 2008 constitution, which is in effect. The constitution gives a favor to the military and the cronies and business associates together with the army. There is no rule of law in place. And now, land grabbing is the widespread across the country situation. We're having this judicial system, which is subordinate and weak, whereas the opposition itself is afraid of the Burma army coming back to the game, and therefore they keep quiet about it. In fact, the army is already up there in the constitution. The opposition is already silenced. And in that case, in the next 10 years, our democracy is quite bleak future.
Thank you so much, Ms. Omar. So it looks like we've got some real doubts about whether the military can indeed be controlled by the laws. Perhaps, Ms. Mo, you'd like to continue that line of reasoning in your 1-minute rebuttal time. Starts now.
Well, the military, I think, for the first time, we are looking at what is going to happen 10 years down the line. For the first time, there are indications that they are interested and willing to become a peacetime army. It is unfortunate what is happening in the ethnic conflict areas, but there is commitment across the government, and key government actors are genuinely interested in fashioning a peace process that will settle all these ethnic conflicts that are plaguing the country. At the government level, there is no hesitance or reluctance to learn from examples in the region and beyond. For the first time, the country is asking international advice and support. It is welcome, and this is a departure from the past very closed xenophobic attitude. And of course, there is also room for the military to submit to becoming a peacetime army in the years to come.
Thank you so much, Ms. Mo. So what she's saying is that they're open to change, they're open to learning, but your experience is different. Explain why in your 1-minute rebuttal.
Well, for the ethnic communities that I work with, that I'm very close to, the reality on the ground sees very differently. The Burma army has shown no sign of backing out. And the current peace process or the peace plan by the government is one-sided and top-down. And there is no sign of being flexible or compromising with the ethnic minorities, but instead to coax them and give them a surrendered settlement. And in that particular case, what we're seeing across the different states in the different ethnic community, we're seeing the increased presence of the Burma army troops over the past months. And in that case, we are very worried of who's going to hold this army accountable. Because at the end, it's not the president, then who else? In this constitution, who's going to hold this army accountable? And also, the constitution itself already is guaranteeing this permanent power for the army.
Thank you so much. Well, we've heard from both sides of the starting argument. It looks like a key area is whether or not the military is going to give up power or it's going to continue hold on to it. Judges, what do you think? Have you been swayed by any of the arguments? Shelva, let's start with you.
Well, listening to the proposition and then listening to the opposition, they're both talking about the same country, but listening to their respective descriptions of their country, you'd imagine that they're talking about two completely different places. Not only two different places, they're even using different names to describe it. You know, the proposition is calling it Myanmar, and the opposition is calling it Burma. Propositions is highlighting the 2008 Constitution and says that this is providing I'm not quite sure whether she went so far as to say firm basis, but a real basis from which to build on, whereas the opposition says this Constitution is not protecting the people, it's not protecting the minorities, it's just protecting the military. Yeah. So I have to decide which country is the real Myanmar or Burma.
Which is the country being debated? Elna, do you agree?
Well, I look at it slightly differently. I don't think there's any doubt that in the next 2 or 3 years, Burma will be a populist democracy. My question is what happens 10 years from now? Because what I'm worried about is whether in the aftermath of great loosening that's happening at such a quick pace, in fact, that will, as history has shown us, very often that just creates a vacuum in which military or other forces may come right back in, ex-military forces masquerading as Democrats may come back in and take over control. So I actually think that the question is easily answered in the next 2 or 3 years, but over the longer term, I'm waiting to hear from someone who can gaze into the future and give us that outcome there.
We're going to throw it over very quickly to Adrian. Do you have a quick question or quick thought that's on your mind right now?
Terrific debate. One side says nothing is changing. One side says because everything is changing. Let's hear more.
Well, that's an interesting start to the debate. It's time for a quick break, and when we come back, we'll hear from the second speakers. Do remember to cast your votes and send us your questions. Stay with us. Welcome back to Bridging Asia, the Singapore debates. We're live in the studio and we're discussing democracy in Myanmar. The country's seen some remarkable changes in the past year. A new constitution has been announced as part of the roadmap to democracy. And while President Thein Sein has said that Myanmar's reforms are irreversible, Aung San Suu Kyi herself has opted for a slightly more wait-and-see attitude. But how long must we wait? The question we're debating tonight, will Myanmar be a democracy in a decade? Now, this is what we're asking in our poll as well, and earlier it sounded like 71% of the home audience as well as our studio audience said yes. That has now dropped to 62%. So it looks like the negative side is gaining some ground. So congratulations. We've heard from the first speakers before the break. Now let's hear from their teammates. Arguing for the affirmative that Myanmar will be a democracy in 10 years' time is Mr. Romain Caillot. Mr. Caillot, you've been quoted as saying that Myanmar will take almost 20 years to reach the level of economic development as Vietnam. What makes you think that democracy will happen before that? You have 3 minutes, starting now.
Coming from Myanmar, I just arrived from there this afternoon. One is very surprised by how buoyant and energetic this country is already. Of course, there are different Myanmars. Myanmar is a country that is the largest country on continental Southeast Asia, and it's difficult to compare the situation between urban Yangon and some rural areas, and worst of the worst, the areas where conflict between ethnic armed groups and the military is ongoing. So yes, we can talk about two completely different countries, and even more. Myanmar is a very diverse country, also ethnically diverse. However, why am I confident that Myanmar will be a democracy in 10 years from now? Is because of two key trends towards democratization. The first trend, as Mo described very well, is a top-down trend. The fact that through the constitution, there is an introduction of a separation between the armed forces and the state. A more pluralistic form of government has been introduced in Myanmar for the first time in 5 decades. Myanmar has not had an experience with democracy since 1962. So that's the first reason. And as part of this process, one can see the civilian state asserting its authority over the military. It's long, it's complicated, but it's a process, like democracy. The second key trend towards democratization, in my view, is the bottom-up trend. I've been living in Myanmar for almost 5 years, and I've traveled extensively around the country, and I've been involved in many types of work. And what one can see is that the civil society is very active in many different ways. Civil society has agency in the way it interacts with state agencies, and this can be the military. There are ways to negotiate with them. These ways to negotiate are becoming increasingly easier thanks to channels that have been created and that allow for public opinion and citizen rights to prevail more and more. For example, the media. The Myanmar media are extremely free nowadays. Second, civil society groups in urban areas and in rural areas. Third, an opposition led by Aung San Suu Kyi, but that also has some ethnic members. Some ethnic groups are represented in parliament, as they believe that it is through the constitutional process that they will best be able to defend the rights of their ethnic brethren. A private sector that is organizing and pushing some of them for liberalization. And 5, the emergence of labor unions and also of other organizations that protest and defend their rights.
Thank you very much, Mr. Caillot. Well, now arguing the negative, we have Dr. Pavin from Kyoto University. Dr. Pavin, Aung San Suu Kyi said yesterday that she's willing to be president, and then said he's not against it. Do you think that there's reason for hope because of that? Do you think democracy is on the horizon for Myanmar?
Who wouldn't say so? If I were Aung San Suu Kyi, I would say yes too. You know, it's an attractive job. I would love it. You know, it's the beauty of us, you know, both of us who live outside the country, outside Myanmar, who can see Burma or Myanmar, you know, more clearly, perhaps than you know, Romain. I have been studying democracy, you know, for so long, especially democracy in Southeast Asia, and trust me, you know, what you have seen in Myanmar, it's just an illusion. Look at Thailand, the country where I come from, you know, we changed from absolute monarchy to democracy. It has been a damn 80 years, and we're still talking about the same thing about democracy. Now, getting back to Burma, or Myanmar. Now, to respond to Eleanor, said that, what about looking in long term, 10 years, you know? I have 4 points, and which will respond to what you said and also more as well. I think first thing we have to go into, you know, look into the role of the military. The military has been for too long, you know, it's become a main institution. So to get rid of the military, it's going to be so difficult. You know, General Tan Choi had a seat, you know, parliament hardliner into the parliament, so it would be very difficult to get rid of them. I don't think it's going to make a reform any easier in the future. The military still occupy 25% of the parliamentary seat. Not to talk about the winning of the military-backed party, the Union Solidarity and Development Party, which up to today occupy 80% of the parliament seats, and there is also a chance that the military could cancel election, which will be held in 2015. It happened before in the past. The military, is known to change its mind now and again, open up, welcome reform, and then roll back things once again. So how can we be guaranteed that the military would do exactly what it say? What about the minorities? The problem with minorities. The Thein Sein government is now returning the power to deal with the issue to in the hand of the military. So basically, you hand over the power back to the military once again. I have a lot of long list of many problems coming up in the next 5 to 10 years. Not to mention the issue of ethnic minority, as my colleague said here. Issue with the Kachin, with the Wa. We haven't even talked about drug trade. Drug trafficking. This is a key problem to democratization also. What about communal conflict? What about the case you haven't even talked about, the case of the Buddhists, clashing with the Muslim Rohingya? What would be the future for the country? The weakness of NLD, people now become too happy about Aung San Suu Kyi coming out. She would become president. Yes, good luck to her. But there is the weakness of NLD. There has been no leadership in LD. They haven't built up the new generation in LD. I have heard that new generation, most of them are very snobbish. They really understand reality on the ground. Time running out, the issue of reconciliation. The military still enjoy the impunity of past years. Can we bring them down? Bureaucracy thing haven't changed. Let me stop it here.
Thank you so much for stopping yourself and saving me that job, but you had a lot of points. Mr. Koyo, I'm sure you have plenty of questions for him and plenty of thoughts on what you've just heard. Your 1 minute of rebuttal time starts now.
I'm not sure it will be possible to rebut all of them in 1 minute, but thanks a lot for raising all those issues. And I think what I hear in Myanmar are two things. We want to do things that we should have been doing yesterday. So there was already before an understanding that things had to change, and now it's a time for change, to change them. However, there is also another say that we hear commonly, it's step by step. It's a process. And for this process to work, different groups must come together and work together. For example, exiled groups that are working on the borders, on the borders, like the one that is headed by Kinoma, have to work with the civil society groups inside that have been promoting the rights of ethnic citizens or Burma citizens, also in a different manner. As for the military, there have been examples, for example, about child soldiers and the role of the International Labour Organization that have demonstrated that working with them might change their practices.
Mr. Koyo, right? 1 minute is not enough time to get through all of those points, but unfortunately we have to end you there. Dr. Pavin, I'm sure you have some thoughts as well. Your 1 minute starts now.
That's a nice wishful thinking. Well, I think the change here we see, and I would say to me, it looks like a cosmetic change. What you're seeing is, I would say that this is a new change where you can see a new distribution of power, but it's among the elites. You're talking about the conflict between the government and NLD and Aung San Suu Kyi. Both of them, they went to the U.S. They came home with a lot of goodies from the U.S. But both the government and Aung San Suu Kyi and NLD never really talk about the key issues. For example, the ethnic minority, which I think this is central to what Burma will move ahead. Myanmar will move ahead in the future. And you keep referring to the media, to the civil society group. These people, they work with agenda to, a couple of editors of some media outlets have been arrested, just a few days ago after it has been opening up, right? And civil society group, I have heard also that some of them work closely with the government. So basically to protect the interests of the new regime.
Thank you so much, Dr. Pavin. Well, ladies and gentlemen, you've heard all 4 speakers now, and I'm sure you in the studio, as well as viewers at home, have plenty of questions for our audience. But let's start with the judges. Shelva, perhaps you have a question to start the ball rolling?
Yes, I have a question for the proposition, actually. You say that Myanmar will be a democracy in 10 years' time. What objective criteria must Myanmar meet then, which it doesn't meet now, for you to be right?
Do you want to start?
Okay.
Well, the question's open to either of you. Ms. Mo,
Right,
perhaps you'd like to
why
start?
don't I take a first stab? I am always reminded of the heydays, the golden days of the 1950s, when Burma, at that time, was implementing parliamentary democracy. Now, there are factors there that look at that were the foundation of a democracy, and of course, you have freedom of speech, you have a strong democratic opposition, plus you have what are called free and fair elections. Looking at Myanmar, a situation 10 years down the line, where we are coming from is to look at what are the institutions that are being put into place now that will serve the country and its people 10 years down the line. It will take at least 10 years for institutions to be firmly entrenched. And I think 10 years is the kind of deadline that is not too long, but is not that short enough that institutions can't be properly entrenched. So what we're looking at is, of course, the kind of commitment and political will, which, having lived in silence for the better part of my adult life, I can see that this silence is now broken. And it has been broken across all sectors of society. We are hearing voices even from the borders. And that is being taken into account when decisions are made. Yes, because of the way that institutions are folded and the pervasiveness of the military, there have been this elite-centric, top-down type of paternalistic type of decision-making that will still prevail. But what is changing is this very important thing of voice and accountability being recognized for the first time. I think we only have to look at the situation of suspending the Myitsone Dam to see how the people's voice actually won the day. And talking to people who were actually involved in making that decision, it was not a clear-cut decision.
Right.
Opinions were split.
We're going to have to stop you there.
Hope.
But actually, Adrian, do you have a question for the other side?
Yes, to the no team. Well, there may be problems and there may be conflict, but you must agree that this particular time in Myanmar's history represents the most optimistic point for Burmese democracy.
Before I let either speaker answer, I'm going to actually combine this with a question from the internet. And one of the questions is, who stands to gain the most if Myanmar democratizes? So we're talking about optimism, but who stands to gain? And perhaps we can throw this open to either of you.
Well, I think we've already seen who actually is gaining now. It definitely is the military elite in power, and their business cronies and associates. That's for sure. But then when you really go and ask the people on the ground, whether they are in the Burman majority, rural areas, or in the ethnic areas, their day-to-day life has not changed in any way at all. And in fact, in many places, there are even more problems because it used to be the Burma army, but now the business cronies are the one, together with the Burma army, grabbing the land of the small farmers and their local communities. So in that case, we are seeing a situation where the current opening is empowering the military, and where the gain is actually going to the elite in power. We're seeing also at the moment, the media and the opposition and the civil society are very vulnerable to be co-opted because there is already a self-censorship imposed on them. And that's what, where the situation is leading. Also coming back to your point, it's of where Burma actually will lead to the next 10 years depends on where Burma were actually before and now. And when we talk about the ethnic minorities, people think it's one place and one area. We're talking about more than 44% of the population who belong to the more than 60% of the land of the country, rich with, abundant with, full of natural resources. And I guess that's exactly what we're talking about. Burma, without addressing these key issue of the ethnic nationalities or the long decades of suffering of the ethnic nationalities, Burma won't move into any positive step. In the Burma situation, without bringing the ethnic nationalities into the political picture, between Aung San Suu Kyi and President Thein Sein, you won't solve the Burma's problems.
Thank you so much, Ms. Oma. Well, perhaps we can throw the same question over to the affirmative side. Who do you think stands to gain the most from Myanmar's democratization?
Sure, I'd like to answer directly to some of Kinoma's assertions here. For example, the fact that things have not changed for the people of Myanmar. Two examples. Land grabbing. Land grabbing has been happening in Myanmar for decades. And in fact, we know about it now because it has become possible to unearth some stories of how land was grabbed by one company or land was grabbed by one battalion 10 years ago, 20 years ago. This is the first time that these issues can be discussed about openly inside Myanmar and discussed with the government. We are even seeing cases where these pieces of land are being given back because of pressure by public opinion. Another example would be the Mison Dam, to which Mo alluded, the fact that this huge hydropower dam in Kachin state was cancelled by the government was a great success for local Kachin civil society organizations that had battled against it for years, but also for the national civil society organizations that got together and took this issue as a cause and unified around it and managed through different means to convince the government to suspend it. It's not straightforward in Myanmar, but there are ways to engage, and those ways are increasing nowadays.
Well, you're right, it's not straightforward. It's a process, as you mentioned. We have some time now. We have a question from the internet, but I'd like to throw it open to the studio audience. Do we have any burning questions from the studio audience? I have a lady in the back there. Perhaps you can just take the microphone and ask a question to one of the panelists.
Hello, this question is for the negative. I'm wondering how much the changes in Myanmar are dependent on the current president. Thank you.
Well, Dr. Pavan, maybe you'd like to start first?
Well, I must say that I admire President Thein Sein. I think he's one of the progressive, among the bunch of old generals, and I think he's rather compromising. And then I think they put him in a very at the right time, at the right position. I think that's why there would be some kind of communication between the current government and Aung San Suu Kyi, and that's how the current regime would survive, and that's how the current regime would gain legitimacy from the outside world. But my worry is not about President Thein Sein, because many people surrounding him, basically, as we know, these are hardliners, in the military, and they just strip uniform, and now they become civilian. But at the end of the day, they are former general. They still have a lot of stakes in the old regime, in the old kind of system. And I'm not sure whether they're willing to, accept that the country is in need of change so much.
Thank you for that. Just very quickly, perhaps we can ask Mo, do you think that the personalities involved, Thein Sein and Aung San Suu Kyi, are they critical to the process? A quick response.
Well, definitely for the short term, yes, President Thein Sein and Aung San Suu Kyi, both their commitments are very crucial to put the necessary systems, institutions, processes in place. But what I've always emphasized is the importance of capacities and the importance of strategic planning. And this has to be done not just for the government officials, but actually also for civil society, for the political parties, to really address that kind of vacuum that we are all afraid of when there is a succession.
That's an interesting thought. We're going to have to leave it there and come back to it after the break. Well, thanks a lot. We're going to take another break. Do remember to cast your vote at the following address. Will Myanmar be a democracy in a decade? Yes or no? When we come back, more questions from the audience and our viewers. Stay with us. Welcome back to Bridging Asia, the Singapore Debates. I'm Gaurav Kirthi. The motion today, will Myanmar be a democracy in a decade? We've got a great panel of opinion leaders debating this motion. You've heard the arguments. Now we want to take some questions from our audience, both at the studio as well as at home. Now, questions have been coming in from the viewers of the website, but let's start first with somebody in the audience. I believe we have a question from the lady in the back. Take the microphone and just address one of the speakers.
Yes, Mo, I'm wondering, to qualify as a democracy in 10 years' time, is the Constitution going to need to guarantee a fair public trial as well as free expression?
I would think so. The 2008 Constitution, I will not deny that it has many flaws, but there is a recognition that there is now a possibility of putting into motion a process to amend what is necessary to be amended. Now, that process itself is not going to be that immediate and straightforward. But we have institutions that are functioning, we have a parliament that is flexing its voice, and from what I've been hearing from people I've been talking to, the military representatives there in the parliament are also not voting as a bloc. In fact, there are good civilized relationships and networks being built up, and because of that, I think any amendment that is supposed to be done to the Constitution will take place in the next decade.
Thank you so much. Do we have a question? Actually, sorry, before we move to the next question, do you guys have any thoughts on that question?
Well,
Definitely.
So many thoughts.
Let me start first.
Let's start with Dr. Pavan quickly.
I totally disagree with
Yes.
this at all. You know, the amendment of Constitution is very crucial. And you said that they will not vote in bloc. It might be true. What about the issue that related to the military itself? What about the issue of trying to giving more space to civilian representative rather than representative from the military? You think they will still vote, you know, against this issue? I think there's a lot of question marks out there. So,
Well, I'll definitely agree and totally disagree with you. It's because basically our constitution is a catch-22. Okay, you have 25% army in the parliament. Without more than 75%, you cannot amend it. In that case, you cannot amend this constitution unless the army agrees with you. So in that case, we have this immunity clause provided to them. So what are we going to do? The parliament itself, Aung San Suu Kyi and the National League for Democracy is only 6%, whereas you have the vast majority from the military-led party plus the 25% army and other proxies.
80% of
Exactly.
USDP.
Yeah, whereas you also have the drug lords, whereas you have the cronies in the parliament. And in fact, the most recent parliament session where Aung San Suu Kyi attended first time, she had only 5 minutes.
I'd like
That's
to answer to that.
Absolutely, go ahead, Ms.
Because
Correa.
I think, have you been reading the newspapers?
Oh,
Because I don't know if you know, but Myanmar has changed a lot over the last 2 years. And
I'm
had the
watching the
feeling,
parliament
I'm hearing about the
on the
Myanmar
TV.
from pre-2010. Myanmar pre-2010 was in a state of emergency. There was no constitution. It was all military, all green, all military. Nowadays, things have changed a lot because, yes, this constitution is not perfect, but it's a beginning of a long process. At least one can start talking seriously about introducing the rule of law like Aung San Suu Kyi is doing, because there is a beginning of a law compared to before.
Well, this is what a debate's all about. Oh, Chelva's jumping in as well. Go ahead.
Weigh in and ask the proposition this question. Do you believe that the military will willingly give up its power? And if you don't believe that, then who do you think is going to make, or what force, or what pressure is going to make it have to give up its power?
I believe it will do it because it has already done.
You believe it will do so willingly?
Yes,
It has
it has already
already done
done it. They have drafted this constitution.
Oh, they've just
they have
done it in
started
order
this
to get a
process.
disguised.
We're moving into
they
a
come
totally
back out
different
and-
segment, so I'm going to have to cut the judges off, and we're going to give the time actually to the audience members first. We have a question from the gentleman over there.
Yes. Therefore, the question is this: is democracy the best form of government for Myanmar? Singapore started from a different starting point altogether about 50 years ago, and we did not select democracy as the only form of government. Now, based on what the negatives have been telling us, I believe that the problems of Myanmar are more confounded than Singapore at its starting point of democracy. And therefore, my question to you is democracy, therefore, the best form of government?
So we'll throw it open to you guys. It's a very fundamental question. Maybe it's a wrong debate we should be having. Is democracy the right form for government?
I think this is a very unusual question, to be honest. It's hard to say. Of course, I think it's better because when you look around, you know, Burma has suffered so much from other forms of governance. You know, you name it, military regime, you know, and then you have only one party here, and then looking around in the region, you have a absolute monarchy somewhere else in Southeast Asia. You have something in between, like in Thailand, which I don't even know what is it, you know, and people seem to, you know, stand up and still continue to fight. And if this is not for democracy, then I don't know what it is.
Dr. Pavan, I'm just going to actually throw it very quickly to you guys. Do you think that maybe slowing down the pace of democracy is essential, or should we get into it as quickly as possible in the case of Myanmar? Would dragging it out give them cold feet? Ms. Mo?
Well, I think the whole point of this debate is whether or not Myanmar will be a democracy within a decade. So there is that time frame that's set. It's not short, it's not long. So there is that pressure on whoever is supposed to entrench these institutions and changes to make sure that in 10 years' time there is a functioning system that puts Myanmar into the ranks of newly democratizing countries. Now, whether or not it is the best form for Myanmar, was it not Winston Churchill who once said it's the worst form of government accepting all the others? So, we have no choice. It is the only system where I think there will be an equality of participation that disregards class or one's former background, and where merit can finally see the light of day.
Thank you so much. We still have plenty more questions, and we have time for that, but unfortunately right now, we're going to jump very quickly to the poll and see what our home viewers are thinking about the debate so far. It looks like 61.4% of the audience think that yes, Myanmar can be a democracy in a decade. While that's good news, it does mean that the yes team has lost some ground. They've lost about 10% of the audience share, and the no team has gone up by 10%. So this debate is starting to close up a little bit. Which team has been able to persuade you? Continue to cast your votes at Channel News Asia, and remember, your vote will decide which team wins. We're going to go for a quick break right now, but when we come back, closing arguments, the final vote count, and we determine who's the winner for this debate. Thank you. Welcome back to Bridging Asia, the Singapore Debates. We've been debating the question of whether or not Myanmar will be a democracy in a decade. We've heard from researchers, activists, and business practitioners on both sides. So which side were you persuaded by? Cast your vote on our website. It's now time for each speaker to give their closing argument. They'll each get 1 minute, and we'll start with the affirmative side. Ms. Mo, your 1 minute starts now.
Thank you, Gaurav. Well, institutions are being built. Starting from 2011, we are looking at a Myanmar where the old era of army government, I believe, is squarely behind us. Institutions are being built and will hopefully have started to take root for democracy by 2022, 10 years from now. And that will progress. Capacities will have been built across all sectors of society. New generations of Myanmar citizens, some of whom are in the audience this evening, nationals, they are looking to come back. Many of them have returned, expatriates and exiles alike. And whatever the mediocre chances of success, they're throwing in their lot with the nation-building process that is going on, contributing their efforts to Myanmar's transition. However mediocre the chance of success seems, and it's because of this commitment, these contributions, there is hope 10 years down the line.
Well, thank you very much, Ms. Mo. Moving over now to Ms. Omar. You have 1 minute to summarize all your thoughts and emotions on this issue. Your 1 minute starts now.
Well, we have looked over 1 year now. There is a decreasing of the confidence among the public in the country as well as on the border on the current reform agenda led by President Thein Sein. The institutions are continuing to be old and dysfunctional with the corrupt bureaucrats who enjoy the status quo of the corruption. And we are facing this vast majority of the vulnerable populations at the ground who continue to be their rights being abused, where there is no way of turning for a justice or redress for their sufferings. And we cannot hold this army accountable, particularly when the Constitution gave the sole right to the army to continue to be in power no matter what. In that particular situation, we are facing Burma in the 10 years from now on with more of this military and the elites in power, where this particular group will be getting the democracy.
Thank you so much. Mr. Koya, you seem to express surprise that there's such a pessimistic outlook. In 1 minute, tell us why there's hope for democracy in Myanmar.
Yes. Well, then, of course, there is still a lot to be done. I mean, Myanmar is one of the poorest countries in Asia. There is still war going on in Kachin State. There are dozens of thousands of people in a dire situation in northern Rakhine State. Yes, it is happening. It's also the Myanmar of today. However, there are so many reasons for hope, and I'm saying it now, but so many others are saying it. Aung San Suu Kyi is saying it. She decided to run in the by-elections in April 2002 to join the parliament, to become part of this political process. Exiles, like yourself, are joining in, coming back to be part of this process, the first time that they can take part in it in decades. the international community is taking part in it. The US government, the European Union are in the process of lifting their sanctions because they believe that this process needs to be supported if it is to be successful and in 2 years to have a proper democracy in Myanmar.
Thank you so much. Dr. Pavin, I know you've also got a lot of thoughts about how this situation in Myanmar is evolving. Tell us in 1 minute why you think it's not going to be possible in a decade.
Whether Myanmar is democratizing or not, I think this is very doubtful. But what I think it is quite likely is maybe Myanmar is moving toward a new form of authoritarianism. Maybe perhaps the one that is very similar or consonant with other contemporary authoritarian regime in anywhere else, even in Southeast Asia. And I say that because I have, because of the factor that I mentioned earlier, the staying power of the military is very difficult to reduce the domination of military in the parliament. Then we talking about the weakness of the opposition, the NLD. We have no other choices, no other alternative choices. We have issue of ethnic minority. The ceasefire agreement had been going on for so long, since the 1990s up until today, 2012. There is no sign of it subsiding. I haven't even talked about, the middle class, which have not really expanding, and the issue of whether the economic opening up will be sustainable.
Thank you so much, Dr. Pavin. Well, we've heard compelling arguments from all four speakers. You've all made your cases, but before we go to the final vote, let's hear from the judges and see what arguments persuaded them. Perhaps we can start with Adrian.
Well, I have to thank both sides for a very lively and spirited debate. I was impressed with the passionate arguments, and I had a feeling that both sides could go on all night talking about Myanmar. And that's a good thing, because this is an important issue, not just for Myanmar, but for all of Asia and perhaps the world. Now, at the end of the debate, I was still very undecided. I could see the arguments of both sides, because on the one hand, the proposition was pointing out that the glass was half full, and the opposition was pointing out that the glass was half empty. But this is a debate not about the state of things today, but about the direction of things for tomorrow. Yes, businesses are grabbing land. Yes, there are different ethnic groups in conflict with the majority. Yes, the constitution is imperfect. And guess what? These are the features of a democracy as well.
Well, we have 2 minutes. I'm going to actually have to move on very quickly.
So
to
I'm
Shelva,
voting for the positive.
Excellent. So we have your vote. Shelva, where's your vote going?
The proposition, I think it was Mr. Caillou, said that there were two trends that made him say yes to the topic. The first was that the top-down movement, which is, and one of the examples he quoted was the civilian state exercising its authority over the military. I found that quite an intriguing statement, because I haven't seen an example of it. I've not heard about it in the newspapers, and Mr. Caillou himself hasn't quoted an example. The other one is when he said that the Myanmar media is extremely free. I've never had that impression or heard that elsewhere. You've never quoted an example, but you've made that statement. Now, if I was convinced about the veracity or the reality of those two statements, I think I would vote for the motion, but I'm not convinced about the reality of it, so I'm afraid I'll have to go for the opposition. But I think Myanmar will get there sometime, but perhaps not within
perhaps
the
not in a
next 10
decade.
years. Yeah.
Elna, you have a minute?
Let's be realistic about this. This is not a country that's had a good history with democracy. The last time this happened in the 50s, for all the reasons that the negative has brought up, it got into such a state of chaos that the army was able to bring about a coup d'etat. I see this as best case, we have democracy, institutions, fine. Bad case, we have a masked sort of authoritarian regime colluding with an elite. That's the negative case. My view, worst case, we actually transition to a populist democracy under an inexperienced civilian government that botches it and opens up a vacuum of power where, unfortunately, much like the 1950s, yet another strong man or other will come in, whether they call themselves a Democrat or not, and essentially take the country back into a position of lack of freedom and democracy. So I'm going to say 2 out of 3 possible cases are not so affirmative.
So where would your
for me.
vote go?
Negative, for sure.
So we have 2 judges on the negative, 1 judge on yes. We're going to take some time now to find out who's won this debate in the new season of Bridging Asia. Take a moment now and think about what you've heard from all the 4 speakers, from the judges. Take out your smartphones, log into your computers, and put in your final vote. And now, for our final tally, let's have it up on the screens. Well, we started with about 71% of you believing very strongly that Myanmar will be a democracy in a decade, and 30% were naysayers. Over the course of the debate, well, the ground has shifted slightly, and we've got about 64.1% saying yes, while the remaining 35.9% saying no, it will not be a democracy in a decade. So, negative team, congratulations for shifting some ground, but the affirmative team, in the end, won this debate. We'd like to thank both teams for an extremely enlightening and engaging debate. And join us again next week when we discuss a perennial topic, migration. Does it reap more benefits or drawbacks? Thank you once again to our speakers, to the judges, to the studio audience, and to you, the viewers. We'll see you again next week on Bridging Asia, the Singapore debates on Channel News Asia. Good night.